The Iranian president begins a diplomatic offensive of Latin America to shore up economic and political ties in the region. Is the visit an effort to circumvent some of the tighter sanctions being considered by the US and Europe? Or is it simply a display of strength by a confident nation? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. President Ahmadinejad arrived in Venezuela on Sunday. He will also visit Ecuador, Nicaragua and Cuba on his 5-day tour. It's his 6th trip to the continent since taking office. Strengthening ties to the region have become one of Iran's foreign policy priorities. His visit is well timed, just as Iran is feeling the heat from tougher sanctions. The country has already been forced to prop up its currency just days after the US made it difficult for foreign firms to do business with the country's central bank. And a European oil embargo now looks likely. That would add the pressure on Tehran. Iran is threatening to respond to the sanctions by closing the Straits of Hormuz, through which 35% of the world's oil passes. Now, Iran has a history of trade ties with several South American nations, and there's no doubt President Ahmadinejad is looking to expand his influence in the region. Adam Rainey filed this report from Caracas.
Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad kicked off his Latin American tour here in Venezuela, which is his main ally in the region. Joining him on this tour, though, are many ministers in his cabinet. The economy minister, the foreign minister, ministers of mining as well. That's trying to show, at least, that they'll be signing several agreements here in Venezuela and in the other 3 countries they're visiting on this tour. Now, it'll be interesting to see if any of these agreements actually come to fruition anytime soon. And in these countries in the past, he's signed some agreements, Ahmadinejad, where he's promised investments, but some of those investments haven't gotten off the ground. For instance, a deep water port in Nicaragua valued at some $350 million for that country was promised in 2007, but that hasn't begun yet. An oil refinery in Ecuador also promised, hasn't begun any construction there either. So these countries are clearly still trying to show that they're allied with Iran, but is that for politics or economics? They probably want more economic development, but we'll be looking to see if that economic development takes any true shape. Now, here in Venezuela, there have been some projects, for instance, ammunition factory in the works, a bicycle factory, but some petroleum projects as well. But you can't really say that Iran is the major trading partner for any of these countries. All of these countries still trade much, much more with the United States and Europe than they do with Iran. The trade with Iran is growing, and it's growing fast, but at this point, the main partners are still in Europe and in the United States.
So, is Ahmadinejad's push into Latin America a way to circumvent the sanctions? And are economic sanctions merely strengthening Tehran's hand? To discuss this and more, I'm joined in the studio by Trita Parsi. He founded the National Iranian-American Council and is the author of A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. In Denver, we have Nader Hashemi, a professor of Middle East and Islamic politics. He wrote The People Reloaded, the Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future. And also with us in the studio is Reuel Marc Gerecht from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's a former Middle East specialist at the CIA. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Trita Parsi, the way the United States and Europe would have it, the reason for this visit by Ahmadinejad to Latin America is basically they're characterizing it as a desperate attempt by the leader of a country that is facing growing isolation. Is that the reason?
There is certain truth to that, in the sense that the Iranians have been increasing their presence in the Latin American countries, partly, perhaps even mainly, in order to be able to build alternative trade partners, etc., in the face of a growing effort by the United States to isolate them. But as your report also said, this is the 6th visit. So for it to coincide with a potential new round of sanctions is perhaps a little bit more coincidence. This was probably planned several months ago. But the bottom line is Iran is facing increased isolation, but it's likely not going to be fully isolated, because there are still certain powers, not only in Latin America but also in Asia, that will retain a pretty strong relationship with the Iranians.
Well, I want to look at the issue of sanctions versus diplomacy with Reuel Gerecht. And Reuel, before we go there, let's look at a statement that was made by President Obama last month. Let's watch this.
When we came into office, the world was divided. Iran was unified and moving aggressively on its own agenda. Today, Iran is isolated, and the world is unified and applying the toughest sanctions that Iran's ever experienced, and it's having an impact inside of Iran.
So, real Gerecht, when we hear what the president is saying there and we look at sanctions versus diplomacy, is this an indication that the United States has not given up on the diplomatic track?
Well, I mean, I don't think President Obama has probably given up, but I think the reality is the Europeans and the Americans have been burned so many times, and particularly the Europeans, who were more than willing to engage and engage and engage and engage. And I think the French and the British in particular have come to the conclusion there's not much profit in it. So is it possible that they will, they'll have further discussions? Yes. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere, and I do think that sanctions, and particularly central bank sanctions, which have really spooked the regime, are going to increase probably substantially.
Okay, let's go to Nader Hashemi in Denver. Is there a danger here that once sanctions is tightened, that Iran would see itself pushed into a corner and might act in a confrontational way with its threat, to carry out its threat, for instance, to close the Straits of Hormuz?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the signs of that right now. These sanctions that are being passed are geared essentially to collapse the Iranian economy. And if Iran cannot export its oil, cannot pay its bills, it's not going to sit back and take those sanctions lightly. It's going to lash back, and it's going to try and demonstrate that it also has cards to play. Many of them in the region in terms of causing trouble for U.S. allies, but also in terms of the global economic recovery. By making threats such as we heard last week of closing down the Straits of Hormuz, that shoots up oil prices, that puts into jeopardy the global economic recovery. So, I think we're headed for very dangerous waters here unless cooler heads prevail.
Trita Parsi, do you agree?
I would agree, and I think just listening to what General Dempsey said this past weekend, the Iranians can close the strait, but the United States can also reopen it. But all that needs to happen is for that type of confrontation to take place, and you are going to see oil prices skyrocket, at least for a while. And it's going to create a tremendous amount of insecurity and instability in the energy markets, which is going to increase oil prices. And that is sufficient to be able to create major difficulties, both for a recovering American economy, but also for the Europeans that are already facing a financial crisis. So this is a situation in which, though Iran, of course, is much weaker, it will not be able to go down without a fight. And that fight is going to be bruising a lot of other countries involved in this. And that's, I think, sufficient to create a realization both on the US and the European side that however difficult diplomacy is, and it has been difficult, but not as difficult as times is being described, it is better than the alternative of actually essentially walking towards a military confrontation.
Real Gerecht, what is the purpose of sanctions right now? What with the Western countries, the United States and Europe, what do they want Iran to do? Simply to declare its nuclear program open? I mean, is there going to come a point where Iran's going to say, okay, we're sorry for what we've done, we're going to now open this nuclear program to full inspection, we give it up, we even agree to have these, we have our uranium enriched elsewhere, and we'll just take receipt of the fuel rods like they agreed to in 2010?
Yeah, I don't think that's likely. I think Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, has made it crystal clear that he has no intention whatsoever of stopping the nuclear program. I mean, that is the explicit aim of these sanctions, to put pressure, sufficient pressure on them so they give up the nuclear program. Again, I don't think that's likely, and I would expect sanctions actually to evolve to something more akin to regime change, to spark, again, some type of political tumult, unrest, the equivalent of what you saw in the summer of 2009. I don't think, by the way, that the Iranians are probably dumb enough to try to do anything on Hormuz, because that could spark an American military reaction that could be quite devastating to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
But if they feel they have nothing to lose?
Well, I think they do have something to lose. That's one of the few ways that I could envision President Obama, who obviously doesn't really want to go there, once you start that, to say, oh, what the hell, we might as well take down the nuclear program too. If Iran is really, as the French and the Israelis believe, within 18, 24 months of having a nuclear weapon, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to lose that weapon, to lose the facilities that have already been developed, I think. And also I have to say sanctions, those sanctions could end up to be crushing. It's not clear that they are going to be able to go up and running within, say, 24 months, the type of pressure that will probably be required to crater the economy.
Okay. Nader, Hashemi, do you think the problem here is that the West, the United States and Europe, for instance, have failed to come to the realization, perhaps the inevitable realization, that Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon one of these days?
I agree. I think the entire policy that we are seeing from the United States and its allies in Europe really has not been thought out in terms of a long-term strategy. I think the United States, the Obama administration in particular, is really responding to domestic pressure groups within the United States, responding to the pro-Israel lobby, responding to sort of segments of the Republican Party by pursuing this policy, which really doesn't make sense if one sort of thinks about what the long-term consequences could be in terms of an immediate war. It also doesn't make sense in terms of trying to bring about an internal democratic opening for Iran's democratic opposition, because these sanctions that we are seeing weakens the middle class, weakens civil society. These sanctions are overwhelmingly opposed by Iran's pro-democracy movement, by the Green movement. They're really counterproductive. And in fact, what they do, not only the sanctions, but the rhetoric that goes with it, it actually strengthens the Iranian regime. And I think the regime in Iran right now is very comfortable playing this game of sort of threats, counter threats, sort of warning the country that we're on a war footing. And so I think the net result is that the prospects for democracy and democratic transition in Iran are actually substantially weakened by existing U.S. policy rather than strengthened. And so that's why I think we're headed in the wrong direction.
If I could just add to that, because I think it's very important, the idea, the fact that the vast majority of the opposition inside the country oppose these type of sanctions, precisely because they tend to hit the population far more so than the government. But also when you take a look at other cases, there's approximately 10 cases in which we've had massive embargoes on countries, and the only one case in which we saw the state, actually sanctioned country, transition towards democracy is the case of South Africa. In the other cases, those dictatorships have not only remained, they have been strengthened. Whereas when you take a look at the more than 34 cases of countries that in the last 50 years have transitioned to democracy from an authoritarian state, they have done so in the absence of anything close to broad-based economic sanctions.
So there's been no coercion, they've actually changed themselves.
Well, I mean, usually democratization comes from inside for reasons that are nothing to do with pressure from the outside or the desire from outside states to see a democracy.
Right. Reuel, do you agree with that this could backfire, the sanctions?
I doubt it. I doubt it. I mean, I don't think you're going to see peaceful transition inside of Iran. I think that was the hope of the reform movement in the 1990s. It was certainly the hope early on.
But I think the point is that
movement.
you might not see change from outside, imposed change, but change will come from within Iran.
Well, no, I think change is coming from within Iran, but I think economic frustration certainly played a significant factor in the Great Arab Revolt. So did indignation at tyranny. I'm skeptical how many people in Iran will rally to the government. I think this is largely done for the revolutionary base, which is probably, I mean, it's a guess, 20–25% of the population. I think for them it's important. I don't think that the regime is going to improve its popularity because of the sanctions that are being put on by an increasing number of countries. It becomes very difficult for the regime to argue that this is just Shaitani Bazurg, just the United States, that's got the great Satan going after them, when in fact, certainly the Western world is pretty united on this factor, and others too.
I think it's interesting though, because there's 2 points that I think are important to keep in mind. One is that in the case of Iraq, for instance, we actually had much stronger embargoes with a much greater international buy-in because it went through the Security Council. Several years of that did not bring about the downfall of Saddam Hussein's regime. In fact, it strengthened it, he remained in power, and eventually the United States actually invaded, and we're still dealing with the repercussions of that invasion. The other point is...
It did crater the nuclear program, though. And
Sorry?
what did create the weapons of mass destruction
And that's the other
program.
thing that is very interesting. Even if it did so, no one in the United States believed that. So we nevertheless still went in militarily, and we're, again, dealing with a disaster from that. The other point is that I agree that chances, or at least the appearance of chances, for peaceful change from within has certainly taken a beating after the 2009 elections. But also I think it's important to realize how close the Iranian population was to getting peaceful change through completely indigenous means, as they were in 2009. So I think there's actually greater hope if we take a step back and see what happened there, of seeing how change could come from within. It's going to be tough for the next couple of years, and the regime is certainly walking in a much more authoritarian and dictatorial direction. But I would not give up on the internal opposition at all.
Okay, let's go back to Denver. To
I would just
go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think what's lost in this conversation about Iran is that the biggest threat that the Iranian regime really faces is not from the outside, but actually from within its own society. I mean, I just checked the news before coming to the studio, and the lead news out of Iran today is a major speech by Iran's supreme leader about the forthcoming parliamentary elections in March, claiming that these are elections that are very important for the Islamic Republic, claiming that the Iranian people en masse are going to welcome these elections, and also claiming that previous elections, including the 2009 election, was free and fair. Iran's information minister last month said that these coming elections are, quote, the most sensitive elections in the history of the Islamic Republic. The regime actually is very paranoid about what's going to happen in the next few months, fearing a repetition of what happened in 2009. And there's a lot of internal discontent. There's a lot of, I think, deep roots, a long history for pro-democracy struggle in Iran. And I think the prospects actually, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, look very good for a democratic transition. And should that take place, I think pro-democracy leaders, should they come to power after a democratic transition, would want to work very closely with the international community to resolve the nuclear question. So, keeping that in mind, one has to ask, is existing U.S. policy, is the rhetoric that we're seeing coming out of the Republican Party in the United States, for example, actually assisting democratic forces in Iran or undermining them? And I think it's pretty clear that they are undermining them. At least that's what the leadership of the pro-democracy movement in Iran is telling us. And so I think if one views the whole challenge that Iran poses to the international community, to the Middle East, from that perspective, from the question of democracy, particularly in light of the fact that now there is a global spotlight that is highlighting the question of democracy in the Middle East, exposing the behavior and the policies of authoritarian regimes, that's where the regime in Iran is most vulnerable. They do not want to talk about human rights and democracy. They love to talk about nuclear weapons and sanctions. And so I think, all things considered, existing U.S. policy is actually strengthening the regime, and it's preventing and delaying an inevitable democratic transition that I think will happen in Iran in the coming years.
I mean, I would agree with certainly part of that. I think that it has been a historical mistake for the Americans and the Europeans to focus so intensely just on the nuclear program, because it would have been far better for them to marry that into a very loud and constant discussion about democracy inside of the country. So to that extent, I would agree with that. But the real issue that you have to deal with is that you have a regime that quite literally, as in its DNA, terrorism, hostage-taking, embassy sacking, that its conception of statecraft is hardly diplomatic. So any American government, whether it's Democratic or Republican, is staring in the face that you've got a regime that has given, for example, long-standing aid to al-Qaeda, has armed other militant Muslim organizations that recently attempted to blow up the Saudi ambassador in a Washington, D.C. restaurant, going nuclear. And that is unsettling.
Let's, well, one of the things that you mentioned, the last thing that you mentioned there, that they tried to blow, or at least Iranian agents tried to recruit a Mexican gangster to kill the Saudi. That's not been proved yet.
No, I don't. Listen, I mean, if everyone that I have spoken to inside of the Obama administration, this is an administration that certainly wanted to put its best foot 2 feet forward with the Iranian government. And when you have these individuals who certainly did not want to come forward and say, that the Iranian, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, was involved in a bomb plot.
I don't want to get sidetracked, but I mean, the guy who was at the center of this has got serious mental problems as well.
Again, I think when you look at there's no doubt that much of this case has to do with intercept.
Okay. I just want to get to the current visit by Ahmadinejad to Latin America. Let's take a look at some of Iran's interests in Latin America. Now, in Venezuela, Iran has opened banks and transportation companies. In Nicaragua, Iran promised to help build a port, and Ecuador was promised an oil refinery. Both of these projects have not yet begun, and trade with Argentina and Brazil has soared in recent years. Brazilian exports to Iran are now worth more than $2 billion a year. Trita Parsi, let me ask you this. What is Ahmadinejad hoping to get out of this visit? Because it's kind of ambivalent, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of words, there's going to be a lot of agreements signed, etc. But when we actually look at what's happening, not much has happened in terms of money passing hands or anything like that. Yet, when we have countries like Brazil and Argentina, countries that he's not going to, Brazil, in fact, is distancing itself from Iran, yet its trade with Iran has gone up.
Well, I think from the Iranian perspective and also from the perspective of some of the Latin American countries, it's not the trade that is at the center of this. It's not as if they don't have other potential partners that they could work with. There is a little bit of a congruence of interest right here between states that essentially oppose the American-led world order. And Venezuela is a clear case of that. So they're creating stronger political ties, but they need to strengthen that and create an additional foundation for it. And that's why you have some attempts at economic cooperation. I don't think neither side are taking those particularly seriously. That's part of the reason why you have a lot of agreements that are being signed but not necessarily implemented. The bottom line is that these regimes, at least, do need each other politically, particularly at these moments. And that's part of the reason why they're doing this.
Reuel, when we look at the oil sanctions that are being imposed against Iran, Iran says, well, you know, it can sell its oil elsewhere. One of the markets, I mean, two of the major markets to which it sells its oil, India and China, have said, well, we're not going to actually impose any sanctions on Iran.
Well, I think the objective actually of sanctions is moving in the direction of what economists call the oligopsony effect, which is that you want to decrease the purchaser pool. I mean, we know already there's tension between China and the Iranians on payment. And what's going to happen, it appears, is if the purchaser pool decreases, then the demands for discounts will increase. And there's been pretty good economic modeling done of this. And if they reduce this, for example, to just China, the Chinese, who are pretty merciless when it comes to capitalist practices.
So you're saying Iran can't be competitive anymore, it has to sell it to China, and China's going to dictate
I think
the price?
What's going to happen is they're going to have far fewer people willing to buy their oil, and that will enforce, they will have to give discounts. And if you look at the precarious state of the Iranian economy, it's not necessarily enough to stop the nuclear program, but if they have to start giving discounts of 20 or 30% on their oil, that is a huge hit to the Iranian treasury.
But actually, there's a little bit more of a complicated picture. I agree with Reuel that is actually part of the objective. It's become more clear as of late that the idea is to reduce the number of buyers to their oil. But at the same time, and hoping that will cause a lot of discounts, the Iranian government would lose money. At the same time, though, the Iranians, by playing some of their cards, as Nader said, can increase the risk premium on oil. And if the price of oil goes up and then they have to do a discount on it, it may not end up being the 20-25% as Reuel mentioned. It could end up being much less. In fact, it could end up being that they make more money out of it because of the sense of tension in the oil market. But the bottom line is this. What we're doing is not because of a well-thought-through strategic objective. It is more so because the only thing that the international community can unify on right now, and even that is very difficult, is a tactic, sanctions. We're pursuing it because that's where we can make sure that there is somewhat of a unified front in the P5+1 against Iran. Not because we actually have a clear idea where this will go, not because we even have a strategy in mind, but it is so important, the consensus is in the Security Council, that the Security Council should be united against Iran and not permit the Iranians to be able to play various sides against each other. The question is, what will this lead to? And unfortunately, it seems like what it most likely will lead to is an impoverished Iran that will become more radical and at some point actually will get the nuclear capability. And I think that's a very worrisome prospect.
Okay, I want to give the last word to Nader Hashemi there. We have literally 30 seconds there, Nader, if you could wrap this up for us. When we look at the sanctions that are being considered against Iran, what are the other alternatives on the table here in Washington?
Well, I think what we really need is a new strategy, and I know that's impossible in an election year because you have to sound tough in order to get elected. But I think the hope piece here is perhaps after the next election, if Obama does become a two-term president, then there will be a serious rethinking of U.S. policy toward Iran, because the current policy is not working as counterproductive.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now, but we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send us your ideas directly to insidestory@aljazeera.net.